Welcome to USC Ideas and Actions, the official University of Southern California podcast. Shows are webcast live on Facebook from Studio 1A in the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Currid-Halkett, and I am the James Irvine Chair in Urban and Regional Planning at the Price School of Public Policy and Professor of Public Policy. And I recently wrote a book called The Sum of Small Things, A Theory of the Aspirational Class. And I must say, it is such an honor to be here with you today. Johanna and I go way back. In fact, you're one of my first friends and colleagues at USC. So this is a real privilege. Thank you.
There was such a fun project that Elizabeth led at the Norman Lear Center, which is where I'm based, called Star Maps, the Geography of Celebrity. So I'm going to try to bring that up in our conversation.
Sounds good.
So I'm Johanna Blakely, and I'm the managing director of the Norman Lear Center, which is a think tank that's based here at the USC Annenberg School. And we study the social impact of entertainment and media. And part of that portfolio is looking at fashion and its social impact, as well as social media, as you can imagine, a real force in changing people's notions of themselves and their lives. It's something we're going to talk about during this hour. And my first question for you, Elizabeth, is I'm really enjoying your book, which I found out about because David Brooks wrote that op-ed piece and really talked up your book. It was a really nice sort of mention there in the New York Times. But I think people might be a little confused that you have a PhD in urban planning and policy, and yet you keep publishing these really interesting books about celebrities and tastemakers and the aspirational class. So I'd just like you to explain to us the connections there.
Thank you, Johanna. So you're not the first person to ask me that question. I initially, when I was in graduate school at Columbia doing a PhD in urban planning, I was interested in why things happen where they did. So in all of my work, whether I'm thinking about celebrity or the arts or more recently how Americans consume, I'm always interested in where it happens and how it's different in different places. And so, with my earlier work, I started out with this, question of, why do we have such a concentration of arts in New York? And particularly young artists who probably can't really afford the rent and there's no space. So what drives them to still concentrate in New York? And what I found was that their social lives really drove so much of their careers. And so even if it was really expensive and competitive to be in New York, they needed to be there. And that has extended a lot into my work on Los Angeles and celebrity culture. And then more recently, my study of consumption, a huge part of studying American consumption habits is studying how they're really different from city to city. So that's the constant link is I go back to why does it look similar and different in different places.
Right. And could you say a little bit about the Star Maps project and the geography of celebrity?
Oh yeah, that was a great project. So when I first got to USC, I had finished at least the draft of my first book, The Warhol Economy, and that was on New York. And one of the obvious things when you study a particular city is, well, maybe the phenomena that you're looking at are actually about a particular place. That, this is how the arts operate in New York. This isn't necessarily some universal truth about them. And so, my next project was to try to understand similarities and differences in other cities. And so I teamed up with Gilad Ravid, who was a doctor.
Oh, right.
Yeah, you remember him. He was great. He's
right.
at Ben Gurion University in the Negev in Israel now. But he was a postdoc here at Annenberg.
Yeah.
And you put me in contact with him.
I introduced you, yeah.
And so I was very interested in how we might quantify these social worlds that seem so important. And so Gilad and I actually we came up with the idea to study photographs. And and this was in 2007 or 2008
it was
when we started.
Yeah.
So this is where I want to ask you about social media, because gosh, it would be such a different data set today.
Oh boy. Yeah.
But then we used Getty Images to track it. We looked at photographs and caption information and tracked where these photographs were taken and where certain art and cultural scenes were located and compared them to LA and New York. And it's really interesting. You found they still clustered in LA. I mean, even though the geography of LA is so different from New York, you find that creative communities really want to concentrate. But this actually gets to something about your work that I think is really interesting is, now we're in an age where, when I was first looking at this, Getty Images was the most robust data set to study behavior and activities of visible people. And today there are so many different outlets. And not just that, but it's not just celebrities in the conventional sense anymore. It's everyone has a way to essentially make themselves a celebrity in their own communities. And so how do you think social media plays into how people choose to represent themselves? Because in a way, it's curated all the time now.
Yeah.
What you put on Instagram, I don't have an Instagram account, I'll be full disclosure. But when I see people's Instagram accounts, I'm like, everyone just looks so great and so happy and so much more glamorous than me. And yet, this is a choice around self-representation.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating that now we have a whole generation of people who are used to thinking about media production and how to produce an image of themselves that they feel will position themselves properly within their peer group or will somehow promote their careers. And in general, I think it's a wonderful thing because it is a certain form of self-consciousness. And it's empowering. There are people who have really important stories to tell, and now they have the opportunity to tell them. They don't have to convince somebody at NBC to do it for them. They don't have to hope that Getty Images takes a picture. They can start building it from scratch. But what really distresses me is that I think even though so many of us get great pleasure out of social media, and admit it, you do. If you just read the newspaper, you think it's the worst thing on earth, that everybody is being sexually harassed, and it's this bitter, awful place where standards of beauty are too high. And once again, we tend to be reluctant to embrace new technology. And I think really filled with anxiety about the way that it's changed our lives. And it has changed our lives quite profoundly. But I would say by far the net is positive opposed to negative.
So do you think that there is a pressure around how we represent ourselves in social media? And so because I follow you and I agree with you that, on the whole, it's social media is better, right? And it gives us all sorts of different ways to communicate. I mean, I was giving a talk yesterday and I said, if not for YouTube, would we have Justin Bieber? I mean, probably not. So there's and
Is
there's
that a good thing or a bad thing?
I kind of like his.
This was a question we asked undergraduates last year.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Is media good or is media bad? And that was one of the questions. Justin Bieber, good or bad?
You know what? I actually kind of like his music.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of people do.
Yeah.
It's good that you admit it.
I admitted it. When I'm going for a run, it's very kind of keeps you excited, and gets you up a hill. Here's what's interesting though is that to me that adds this layer of pressure that do we get to give our authentic self, when we have all of this pressure on social media to even if it's implicit to compete with our peers, to at least our online community that, we also have this great glamorous life and we, look great after a run or we went to this great restaurant. And so I'm just wondering how that plays on the psyche of people or maybe we make too big a deal out of that. Maybe, kind of what you alluded to, it that's okay. It doesn't cause as much pressure as the mainstream media might like us to believe.
Well, I think what it does, the fact that we have these social media platforms that we didn't have before, what it brings into relief is what was problematic in our offline lives before. Because guess what? We take all the same anxieties and the same troubles. We curated our looks and what we wore when we didn't have social media because we were concerned about what people would think of us in class or at a bar or running down the street. Now we do it online as well. So I see the virtual world as a sort of a simulated reality, right? Where you see a mirror version of all the same anxieties and also strengths and opportunities that we grasp and live through in our own lives there. Because there's so much inspiring content in social media. Admit it. You've been inspired by stuff on social media. I don't know why so many people are committed to denigrating what I believe is a platform that has really made it possible for a lot of people who felt completely voiceless and invisible to have a voice and be visible.
I really buy that. I think that's a really great and supportive way of looking at social media. And you know, it's interesting, just, you know, again, the only social media that I really engage with is Facebook in a very cursory way.
And that's
as
the other thing, is you always have the option of opting out.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
And it's kind of an elitist thing to opt out.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh my goodness,
It's a
I had no
status
idea.
thing.
I'm cool.
That's right. It's a cool status thing to say, oh, I don't do Facebook anymore.
Really?
No.
Oh my goodness.
I'm going to be harder to find. You're not going to know everything. You'll have to look for me in Snapchat. You'll have to look for me, right?
That's very good. I hadn't thought about it like that, but it's also, it's kind of the aversion to getting the next iPhone too. There's a sort of status built into that as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So, but you know, on Facebook, one of the things that I thought was really neat last night when I was looking at it was, there were a few friends, like one of my friends is publishing a book, one of my friends from high school is publishing a book, and another friend just had a child, and another friend came back from a trip, and I thought, I'm really happy to know those things about those people.
Right.
So, you know, I think you have to filter through the noise of maybe, you know, lots of people's, you know, really exciting parties and so forth that might be less interesting, but then you really find these really important things that you would never know if not for social media.
It's great for keeping diasporic communities
Yes.
in touch with one another. Black Twitter is something that we've studied quite a bit at the Lear Center, which is really interesting. But I want to talk more about your book. One of the things that you point out, which may be at odds with what people think about what social media has done to our society, that now, you know, we have to display what wonderful lives we have, and we have to show off all of our goods and our wealth. And your book really sort of takes that presumption to task by saying that the new aspirational class is less about conspicuous consumption and more about inconspicuous consumption. And I think that's such an interesting idea. Could you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I was always really inspired by Thorstein Veblen's work, and he wrote this really cool book in 1899.
I know, cool, from the 19th century.
I know, and all through graduate school I loved it, and I would refer to it. And it really informed my work when I was studying the arts, because he really is essentially talking about taste. And he came up with the term conspicuous consumption, which is this use of material goods and objects to show where you are, where you stack up socioeconomically. But, you know, the 20th century brought us so much stuff. And I think that became much more complicated. And, you know, maybe you can't afford the Hermes Birkin bag, but you can afford a bag that looks a lot like it. Knockoff markets are pretty good. Coach makes great stuff for a fraction of the cost. And so a lot of people were dealing in, and remain to deal in the currency of material goods as a way to show social position, to the extent to which I believe that material goods diluted in their power. So, you know, that was a theory I had, and I was interested in fact, I started looking at silver spoons. Flatware.
Oh, right.
So I started
you
looking.
The book. Yeah,
I started thinking about, you know, okay, so Thorstein Veblen had this famous example of the leisure class using silver spoons, and I thought, well, we don't really have a leisure class per se in the 21st century, but who is buying these silver spoons? And it turned out that the top 1% were not.
Yeah.
And so it got me thinking about what they were spending money on. And so when I looked at the data, their material purchases were actually going down, particularly post-recession, and the middle class was about the same. And in terms of total expenditures, you found that the rich were spending less on conspicuous consumption, but there was this group of services and goods that could only be really described as inconspicuous consumption because they're high cost, really associated with this top income group, but really largely invisible. And not meant ostensibly for show. So it were things like, education and healthcare and retirement and gardeners and housekeepers and childcare. And the story that really emerged was that people were spending money on quality of life and on things that shored up their well-being and their children's. And so that really became this, whole group of things that were really relegated to the elite, even if we couldn't see them.
I mentioned to you I wore this sweater in particular today because I thought it would have been a perfect example for your book. Because you talk about the kinds of objects that people in the aspirational class purchase. They don't necessarily scream wealth and privilege, but they're supposed to communicate something about the values of the aspirational class. And I think this sweater is a perfect example. It came from a TED swag bag, which is, I think, the perfect place to find anything that the aspirational class would like to have. And the remarkable thing about it is not the look. It's a very plain gray wool sweater, but inside there's a tag that's called a BA code. Which is a specific number that indicates the sheep that provided the wool for the sweater.
That's very
impressive. And so I can go online and I can check and see how he's doing, whether he's still kicking.
You are feeling so good about yourself right now, aren't you? You should feel great. Go eat a Snickers bar. You deserve it.
And it means that this reflects my values, that I care about animals, and that I care about sourcing, and it becomes a topic of conversation, right? It's part of a narrative, opposed to just bling, opposed to just wearing some big logo.
Well, and what's really great about that example, this is absolutely aspirational class. I want one. I have to get asked to give a TED Talk. Are they still giving them out?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, maybe it's only if 1 million people look at your video. Right. Okay, maybe then you get that swag bag. Anyway, so you're in that very elite group of people. So what's really interesting about this is that when I looked at the expenditures, they were the physical embodiment of cultural capital. And so, I just talked to you about things that are really expensive, like, paying for childcare and education. But actually, this is why Whole Foods exists. Yeah. And, this is why we have artisanal coffee and direct trade and fair trade, because there is demand for goods that make us feel like when we are consumers, we're doing the right thing. And it's not, I don't think it's sanctimonious at all. I don't judge in any way. I'm one of those people too. You want to feel that when you are spending money and you are a part of the consumer culture, that you're doing no harm. And that you are, to use the phrase I wrote in the book, you are aspiring to be a better human. And this is a perfect example of this. There's no sweatshop involved. Right. You know that the animal's still doing well. You can track it. No one can lie to you about that.
It seems like a joke on Portlandia,
why is this such a popular show?
Right. Joked about that.
Yeah. So,
like, can I meet the chicken that this egg came from?
So this is somewhere where I think our work really overlaps. So the aspirational class is essentially a taste community.
Yeah.
So maybe some of it is, smart practical decisions like saving up for college education. But a lot of it is taste. The type of exercise you do. Do you meditate? What podcasts and so forth. And people connect around those tastes. And increasingly, we're observing that some of those tastes are very elite. And even if it's by accident, quite exclusionary, right? You have this very famous TED Talk on social media and gender. And in this talk, you very convincingly argue that, demographics don't tell us about a person. These kind of old school techniques for getting at consumers, misses it. That in fact, social media revolutionizes how we can understand people. And you talk about how people form taste communities. So how do you think social media then shapes taste industries like fashion? I mean, do these taste communities really shape and inform how fashion thinks about itself, or do you think the future of fashion?
Oh, absolutely. I think social media is really the killer app for the fashion industry. They have always been really connected to the street. I think if you talk to any famous designer, no matter how high level, how expensive, how luxurious, they always say that they have to stay connected with consumers. They have to know what people are doing on the street. And so they can't just dictate fashion trends from above.
Right.
And they've always had their ear to the ground, trying to make sure that they're relevant. And now with social media, they have a huge global database of taste preferences to take a look at. And a lot of fashion moguls have really taken that quite seriously. They're starting to do their collections online instead of actually showing at New York Fashion Week. Some designers are just doing their shows on Instagram. And I think one reason that they can do that is because they have a really good sense of their audience. They have a very clear sense of who this influencer in particular attracts to their Instagram feed. And so this is exactly what the media industry would call audience segmentation. Right? You have automatic audience segmentation happening on the social media channels where people are self-selecting into audience groups that have shared interests. That's the drive, is they want to meet other people who are interested in what they're interested in. They want to learn more about this niche bit of culture that they're obsessed with. And that's the perfect opportunity for marketers and for advertisers to be able to sell new kinds of goods to these automatic taste communities. It's a much more it's a much simpler process than trying to find the demographic group that might have a subgroup within it that would be interested in your product.
Well, and what's also really interesting about that example is that, you know, cult products, which can be super high end or some, you know, Adidas sneaker for $50, but that social media and the taste communities around it, like a particular fashion blog that writes about, you know, a shoe or a t-shirt, that can be a complete game changer for a fashion designer or a particular good that becomes so coveted. And I have to say, I don't think 15 years ago we would have been able to do that in the same way with all sorts of different items, right? So of course, you know, certain kinds of watches and designer goods have been coveted, but this idea of these really interesting new designers or, you know, goods that aren't, you know, on the runways are now, you know, there's this sort of cascade effect in terms of everyone wanting it or someone writing about it and then it being on Twitter and then everyone's paying attention to it because of the power of social media.
Yeah, and when the big designers knock it off,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
they get in trouble because the taste community that developed around that indie designer gets angry, you know, that some rich dude in Italy decided to steal this great idea from a little Canadian indie designer.
Right.
And suddenly they're on the map.
Yeah.
So even though the knockoff world is really brutal, I mean, it's rough to make a design that you don't own. You can never own a fashion design. Anybody can knock it off.
Yeah.
That's the subject of another one of my TED Talks. It's infuriating, I'm sure, but it creates this really interesting, very vibrant, very competitive, taste-driven culture
Yeah.
where people are constantly trying to one-up each other, and they're trying to communicate what their signature style is, what their very specific taste is, so that if you can create something that has the markers of a unique identity, that's the best brand in the world you could ever create.
Absolutely. No, that's true. And you get this kind of this is John Seabrook's term, but no brow. Where you get this sort of high and low brow, this kind of merging of street culture with, you
opposed to middle brow.
Exactly.
Oh, no, very different.
That's very funny. Well, according to the aspirational class, it's very different. I mean, I do wonder if it's just semantics.
Right.
But the other thing that is interesting about what you say is that, you know, when I did interviews with New York fashion designers way back when, they also talked about this same collecting of ideas from, you know, folks who weren't mainstream fashion, and they would go to nightclubs. Like they'd go to Brooklyn and they'd look at nightclubs, and you know, the story goes that Hadi Slimane, when he was at, I think it was at Dolce & Gabbana, he got this idea for the skinny suits from, you know, the kids in the nightclubs. So, you know, this is just, you know, 15 years on, but a version of the same practice.
Oh, yeah. And now the street is a virtual street that's global.
Yeah.
So if you're stuck for an idea, you know, just tune in to some African fashion sites and boom, your mind will be blown.
Yep.
You're going to see textiles you've never seen before, designs you've never seen before. And I think that's a really exciting sort of global cross-pollination. That there are all these possibilities of intercultural communication that we have now because of this bizarre simulated virtual world for fashion that we now have, that I think is really exciting.
I agree with you, and I think one of the things that's interesting that really connects, I think, both of our work is that it is about these, this kind of mosaic of taste that now we have a greater understanding and a way to find those communities through social media.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. All right, I think our time has run out. Thank you for joining us at Studio A at the USC Annenberg School. Send us your questions, post them on Facebook. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Facebook.